Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Pam Kastner. I have the honor of serving as Patent State Lead for Literacy. Joining me this evening is Nancy Hennessy, who has been with us all the way in this series, as well as my colleagues, Kirsten DeRoche and also Andrew Bell. Of course, Dr. Reed will be joining us in just a moment to deepen our knowledge of literacy knowledge. But before we begin, I want to remember all the amazing presentations that we've had in this series. This is a 10-month series, and this is our 9th month. So I want to thank all of you for being so participative in this presentations every single month. So just as a review, in February, Nancy Hennessy provided an amazing overview of Hollis Scarborough's Reading Rope. In March, Dr. Lucy Hart Paulson joined us to deepen our knowledge of phonology and phonemic awareness. In April, Dr. Louisa Moats joined us from her vacation in Hawaii to deepen our knowledge of phonics decoding and encoding. In May, Dr. David Kilpatrick joined us to deepen our knowledge of sight recognition. In June, in the summer, you were with us. You stayed with us all through the summer. Thank you. Dr. Sharon Vaughn joined us as we went to the upper parts of the rope for background knowledge. In July, Dr. Susan Newman deepened our knowledge of vocabulary. In August, Nancy Hennessy and Nancy Eberhardt stepped in so nicely for William Van Cleve and did an incredible job deepening our knowledge of syntax. In September, joining us from the UK was Dr. Kate Kane, deepening our knowledge on verbal reasoning. And tonight we have the honor of Dr. Deborah Reed joining us to deepen our knowledge of literacy knowledge. So let me tell you a bit about Dr. Reed before we start. Dr. Deborah Reed became the director of the Iowa Reading Research Center in 2015 and is on the faculty of the University of Iowa College of Education, where she is currently a professor in the special education program. Dr. Reed spent the first 10 years of her career as an English language arts and reading teacher, as well as a reading specialist, working primarily with students exhibiting serious reading difficulties. Since 2003, she has been a researcher and technical assistance provider in numerous states. She has published extensively and continues to research methods for improving reading instruction and assessment, particularly for vulnerable populations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Deborah Reed.
Thank you, Pam. I'm so happy to be with you this evening. And as you know, you see on your slide here, the reading rope. We are in the final portion for you. Oops, let me make sure it's going to show up for us on literacy knowledge. So that's where we are oriented on our rope, which is in the language comprehension part of the strands that get woven together for skilled reading. You can see what is listed there is print concepts and genres. But I think we were chatting a little bit before this started. I think that those are slightly misunderstood and perhaps not as well recognized in our discussions about scientific research as perhaps they should be. So hopefully we'll shed some new light on these this evening. Again, we're going to first start off by talking about different aspects of concepts of print and the research behind that before we move into what we mean by an understanding of genre. And what I promised to tell you tonight is both what we know as well as what the limitations are of current research. I'm very big on being honest and on saying that sometimes the practices that we have to implement in classrooms with kids exceed the boundaries of available research. And there are times where we have to do what we have to do because these kids are in front of us, but we need to be aware of where we are stepping outside of those boundaries and where research someday hopefully will catch up with us. I know that others in the research community are saying this as well, but I just want to echo it that if we are going to talk about being true supporters of the science of reading, which is a body of knowledge from scientific research about reading, then that means that we have to be true to that when the research tells us that even if what we think is right today suddenly tells we have findings tomorrow that say we need to be doing something different. So that's why I think it's important to understand where the limitations are and where possible changes might be coming or where we hope that we'll have additional information to do better in the future. We will throughout be looking at ways to apply this to classroom instruction. I've built in some activities and I'm not really sure how this is going to work with the number of participants that we have. So I may be calling on Pam and Andra and Nancy to jump in and be the voices for people who would otherwise be participating. But I would welcome everyone to join in on chat. I think that's a pretty quick and easy way to make your contribution or to respond to some of the information that I'm putting up and asking for your input. So let's get started with concepts of print, which is our first component. And this we're going to divide into different areas, starting with environmental print, which we are exposing children to at very early ages, often when they're riding around in the car or interacting in social environments. They are being exposed to things that we hope they will come to recognize as words and letters, because words and letters function differently than other kinds of visual stimuli that children will see in their environments. So we really want to draw their attention to that. Initially, they may be looking at kinds of graphics and other sorts of visual stimuli that might have words and letters around with them, but we want to hone their attention in on what the words and letters are. So when you think of some examples that children would see just on a regular basis, interacting in social environments, they might see labels on products. They will see traffic signs and billboards and other sorts of logos and advertisements even. So they're being exposed to lots of things that contain imagery, and some of that imagery also contains print. What we know from research, however, is that there is a context in a lot of environmental print that supports children understanding what those words or letters are, that if we remove that environmental context and just put the words and letters in front of them, they would not recognize. Only children who are developing early reading abilities end up recognizing the words and letters that are embedded in the environmental print that they see all the time. So I have a friend who has a child and they drive down the street and she says her young daughter will notice the McDonald's sign and make some sort of imagery or something that represents that she's acknowledging the McDonald's sign. Would this happen if we just gave her the letter or the print outside of the context of seeing that in the environment? So let's take a look at what that would be like. So here's our first image. What would it take for a child to be able to recognize what this is versus if we see this? Which one do you think a child is more likely to recognize as stop, or to say stop, as though they're reading the sign? The one on the left or the one on the right?
One on the right.
One on the right, here they come. And why is that? The shape, yeah, Suzanne's giving us a suggestion here. Yeah, there's shape. There's also familiarity. It's in your community. Yes, and Kimberly just entered. It's a community sign, and Suzanne's adding the color, and Aaron's saying the context of being on the street. This is a neighborhood. So every day when you leave your house, you're driving down this street, you're stopping at this sign, and maybe a parent or somebody you're riding with in the car says, it's a stop sign, we have to stop here. And so there's all of that that adds to the familiarity of it that makes a child recognize it as stop. But if we pull the word stop out, even maintaining some of the colors, in research studies, only children who are already developing early reading skills will recognize this word. So they didn't just acquire the word because they were exposed to it in the environment. There is other context that supports it. Let's take a look at another example. So every morning at breakfast, maybe you're sitting down and you say, do you want your Honey Nut Cheerios today? Or the child looks at the box and says, I want the Honey Nut Cheerios and not some other cereal that's there. But if we pull those words out, as you see on the right, as opposed to the full box on the left, which one are they more likely to actually acknowledge the words for? Left or right? Here we go, left, 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 box on the left. What supports understanding that those are Honey Nut Cheerios and that the words on there say Honey Nut Cheerios? It's not in the community this time. We have pictures, we have the alignment of it, we have the symbols, the B, that's right, the B even, the shape of the words, you have the actual cereal on there, yes, and the breakfast time mascot. So there are lots of things that kind of fool you into thinking your child is reading the label on the box of cereal. What we hope is that they are actually acknowledging the words, but only children with early reading skills understand that what says Honey Nut Cheerios are the words, not just this box or this image as a whole. Same thing if we see just the word for Amazon versus you get the box on your doorstep that says Amazon. There's context that supports that, even though we don't have a whole lot of pictures. You have the smile symbol, but if you're in my community in Iowa, that same sort of smile symbol is used with our grocery store too. So you'd have to be able to distinguish that this is Amazon from our grocery store Hy-Vee. But again, the box and everything associated with getting a package from Amazon would support a child in understanding that's what the words are, as opposed to the print in isolation. And this is for my friend with the McDonald's symbol. So we have the word McDonald's. This is their new and fancy logo here, versus if you're driving down the street and you see the whole restaurant, the child is more likely to recognize the M and to understand that that is McDonald's than if we just put the print in front of them. So that's a really important thing to consider, is that there's all kinds of context supporting print. We do want this exposure to print, but it is the context around it that is helping all children. And what that means when we go to the classroom is we're putting labels up everywhere. And we think that this exposure through the labels in our classroom might be sufficient, that the children will learn this is the word for pencils because that's where the pencils are. But in fact, we know that just the mere presence of that print in any environment, be it in the community or labels in your classroom, is insufficient. And the recommendations are that we incorporate those environmental print words that we have throughout our classrooms into our word study instruction, so that we're specifically pointing them out. We're providing direct, explicit instruction in this word and in attending to the print within this word, the letters within this word, and reading the word, and not just recognizing that this is the place where the things that I need are located. So I think that's an important element, because putting the labels up is the easy part. Figuring out how to connect it to your word study instruction is a little bit trickier, especially with some of the words that we see on the labels here that are not typical words that we teach in pre-K and K, but yet the labels are around the classroom. So moving from environmental print, now that we're in the classroom, we also want to draw students' attention to concepts of print associated with book reading. So this is a next step, or another and more advanced step. This includes understanding which part do we read, and attaching the meaning to the part that we read, not to the pictures. The pictures support the meaning, but the meaning really comes from the print. Children have to know how to hold the book, which way to turn the pages of the book, the orientation of it being right side up or upside down. They have to understand what's the front, the back, and eventually we want them to understand the direction that we move in when we read the print in English. They also have to distinguish what are letters from what are other symbols or numbers that appear on the page. So I'm going to use a couple of pages from this book throughout this evening as we look at different ways that we might incorporate picture books and shared reading into the instruction around both concepts of print and genre, understanding of genre. So we'll return to those pages a little bit later. What we know about the importance of concepts of print that seems really basic. They need to know how to hold a book. They know how to turn the pages. They know which way is right side up. Really is a bit more involved, and in studies dating all the way back here to 1987, which for some of you, you might be looking at that and thinking how young you were. The rest of us are not. We're thinking about how old that makes us feel. We know that this basic, what seemingly basic skill of concepts of print influences graphic awareness, which in turn influences phonemic awareness, which is needed in order to be able to attach symbols to those individual sounds with grapheme phoneme correspondence knowledge, which is necessary for developing word reading knowledge. And so that is why concepts of print ends up being really predictive of later reading proficiency, which was noted by the National Early Literacy Panel back in 2008. Because it has this sort of cascade effect of influencing one thing that influences the next, that helps us build to the next piece, et cetera, until we get to actual reading ability. So it's seemingly simplistic, but it's a really critical first piece in acquiring all of these skills that work together to end up with reading ability. It looks like some things are coming in chat, but I'm not sure if those are things I need to answer or not right now. So I'll wait for you to stop me.
Dr. Reed, there are comments in the chat. But there is one question. Would you like me to ask it now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so this is from Jen. I'm stuck between what is using the picture only and what is reading the actual word. Many of my students are just reading or stating the word because it has a picture and are not actually using the sounds to read at all. Is there a benefit? That's a good question.
Yeah, so I think, and is this a person that says I should reference I teach K? Is that the same person?
Jen, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Yes, that's me. I teach kindergarten.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think there's an element of wanting children to associate with books and feel comfortable holding books and turning pages in books and just understanding this is a book and this is used for enjoyment, even before they have deep knowledge about what are words and what are the parts that we read, et cetera. We want them to associate books with fun activities and feel confident in interacting with books. So there's a benefit to that. But I'm going to show you how to start teaching children to pay attention to the print in just a minute here so that you can begin to transition them into attending to print or understanding, at least even before they can read all the print, what is the part that is read that conveys the meaning, so that we're getting them off of that idea that all I do is look at the pictures and I'm figuring everything out from the pictures. We want to move their eyes onto the print. So let's talk about teaching concepts of print. So first of all, I always like to point out that many, especially pre-kinder, kinder teachers will say, but we have kids that come in with all of these different abilities. And certainly if you've been exposed to a lot of books and done a lot of adult child book reading at home as a very young child, you're going to come in with great advantages compared to other children who, for whatever reason, did not have those experiences. I'm not really big on blaming parents for this. I think we have a lot of families where parents are working multiple jobs. We have families for whom having books in the home is just simply not part of their culture. I work with people who say to me that just wasn't a thing, that they don't have books in the home. That wasn't part of their family experiences with bedtime stories, et cetera. So their parents are perfectly loving, wonderful parents and want the best for their children, but that's just not part of their experiences. So we can't blame them. And sure, it gives children an advantage if they've had those experiences before they come to school, but all is not lost. Children learn more and develop more based on their school experiences. And that's what's really critical, is what we provide them when they're with us at school, and don't worry so much about what did or didn't happen at home. This is your chance to take advantage of the time that you have with children. And that includes both how you set up your classroom, the kinds of things you put in your classroom, the availability of books and print in different forms and fashions, and how you show children how to use those. So it's what you have and how you incorporate these different learning opportunities into the day, into everything that you do in the day, where you have exposure to print or opportunities to interact with children. So one way, and we're going to talk about the different kinds of read aloud, going back to our book pages, the different kinds of read alouds that we can do with children, these being focused on getting them to attend to print, to move off of looking at the pictures and understanding more what's going on with the print and the way that print conveys meaning. So there are different categories of questions that we ask as we're doing a print-focused read aloud. That includes orienting children to the book and the print organization, print meaning, letters, words, etc. So I'm going to show you what this looks like using our sample book here. And we would start by saying something like, the author, Jacqueline Woodson, wrote all the words in this book. Notice how we say, wrote all the words in this book. So we would point it out, our author, Jacqueline Woodson, okay? And then we might say something like, this is the title of the book. It tells us the name of the book. I start reading here, and I read this way. The day you begin. The day you begin. Okay, so we start even on the cover with that. When we go to a page like this, and I'm jumping ahead in the book, trying not to break copyright restrictions by using the book, we might say, this is the top of the page. This is where I begin reading, and we point to it and we start our reading. There will be times when no one understands the way words curl from your mouth. And then we might say, this M is an uppercase letter. See how it is bigger than these lowercase letters? So we're pointing out these different features of the print, the difference between uppercase and lowercase. Notice that this is print focused. We're not asking questions about what's going on in the story. We're not pointing out vocabulary words. We're pointing out features of print, things that we want children to attend to. We're still reading the book, but when we stop and talk about it, we're talking about features of print with this. This is a print-focused read aloud. Then we might even point out the punctuation. This is a period. See the dot after the word? It tells us where the end of the sentence is. Can you find other periods on this page? Now let's count the number of sentences together after they find the different periods. We have to distinguish the difference between the comma and the period. So where are the periods in here? And since they tell us where the end of the sentence is, we can count the number of sentences in there. It reinforces the concept of sentences, as well as the difference between punctuation, how punctuation interacts with letters, and forming the print that we're reading. You could also talk about the numbers that are apparent in our clock over here, but that's not part of what we're reading. So we're not going to necessarily draw students' attention to that unless we want to contrast what are numbers and what's part of the picture with numbers versus what is part of the print. If we had a word bubble coming out of our character's mouth, we would point out the print that was in the bubble that came out of the character's mouth. We don't have that in this case, so we don't have a question specifically for that. When we go to this page, that has a lot of picture and the words are now pushed over a bit to the side. We might start by saying, which is the part that I read on these pages? Where are the words? What will the words tell us? So that we're focusing on the words and understanding what the words do.
There's a question, if you don't, is it okay for me to interrupt just quickly?
Yes, please.
The question is there an age that children could start to conceptualize this? My 2-year-old son loves books and already knows how to hold books the right way and turn pages. He also has parts of the books memorized from all our reading. Would I start this process with him?
Yeah, I see no reason not to. If he already understands how to hold the book and what the basic issue is with the book, then start drawing his attention to the print within it. And especially if he's memorized portions, he understands what's happening with reading, but drawing his attention to that part that he memorized is contained right here. And you can start doing your print matching even with him. I don't think that I know of any research that says it's harmful to do that early. So that's the good news. What's harmful is if we never do it at all. And I will also say that I'm showing you an example right now of a print-focused read aloud, but there are other things that you'll want to do with your son, even at the age of 2, that we'll be talking about later when we're looking at knowledge of genre and the development of narrative skills. There are different kinds of questions that we would ask and different things that we would point out within the print. But there's no harm in doing it early. They may not pick everything up, but you might as well, especially if we have the early skills of understanding how to hold the book, we might as well get started.
So even quick question.
Oh, sure.
We have done this in the past, but using big books. Would you recommend using regular or trade books instead?
Well, big books are nice if you have a group in front of you, because it's really hard to hold these smaller books up and talk about individual letters. Or can you imagine trying to point out periods and count the periods when you've got a smaller book in front of a large group of children that's on the rug in front of you? So big books would facilitate that. We were commenting at the start of this session before we really got started on the presentation that there are some advantages to the pandemic. There are lots of disadvantages, but some of the advantages to the pandemic have to do with all of us connecting, but also with being able to display what would otherwise be a smaller book and do a sort of print-focused read aloud via your virtual instruction, or in other ways that we have maybe family members joining with the child remotely and trying to participate in that bonding experience of book reading that they can capitalize on to display the book and point out things within the book. So certainly if you've got a group in front of you, a big book would be more advantageous for pointing out features of print. Anything else, Pam?
No, I'm sorry to interrupt. It's just it's nice to ask them while you're teaching that specific point. So thank you.
I agree. Yes, interrupt away. So in this case, we have something that's really not a complete sentence, but it does exist as a word, and it has punctuation, and it's all relevant to the story. But we might capitalize on that to say, show me one letter within this word, the distinction between what is a letter versus what is a whole word, because we do have a word all by itself on this line, so we can take advantage of that. And we might take a sentence and say, let's point to each word in this sentence while I read it to start getting that print matching, to understand the individual words within sentences that we say. Their travels going on and on. And if you have a big book, again, that facilitates it. If you're sitting one-on-one with a child, you can take their finger even and use their finger to touch the words as you're saying the sentence and involve them in tracking the different words being read. Oh, I just saw something come in. You want me to pause?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I said, would it be more beneficial to present a book through a document camera to show page turning, etc., than presenting pages of a story as a slideshow and presenting digitally online?
Yeah, Eva, I think that's a great suggestion, is to still show the turning of the pages and how we move through the book. Yeah, I did this for us tonight and tried to make it look at least like the book. But yes, if you've got a smaller book and you're trying to either show this virtually or display it for even a small group, using the document camera would be preferential for sure. Good suggestion. Okay. So that's a lot of concepts of print. I saved the majority of our time for talking about understanding genre because I think it is the least discussed and the most misunderstood. I think a lot of people can grab on to things with concepts of print or know some pieces already about that. So I did want to privilege our time for talking about understanding of genre tonight. And I will start this by saying in, the late 80s, early 90s, there was a lot of talk about genre theory in Australia and in parts of the United States. So I'm going to distinguish that a little bit because it was more about discourse communities and developing patterns of discourse and inculcating students into the language of school as a way to get them ready for the language of books. But that's not what we're really talking about. To the extent that there's an advantage of doing that, of sort of inculcating children into this language of school and books, then sure, that would be helpful. But we're really talking about something else with genre. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there, that if you do a search for genre theory, you may run across these other things that are more linguistically oriented in the social aspects of language. We have lots of yeses, but I'm not sure what that means. So
I had just asked a question if this is the first time they'd heard of a print-focused read aloud.
Oh.
So I'm getting lots of yeses, and so it's a great takeaway. So thank you, Dr. Reed. It was a curiosity of mine. Sorry about that.
Excellent. So we're going to talk about two categories here when we refer to genre, and these are what I would consider to be kind of gross or large categories of fiction and nonfiction. And then we're going to break this down a little bit and say what that means within these two categories. But first, let's talk about what we know about the differences between fiction and nonfiction as these large overarching distinctions in genre. My doctoral student and I just finished a thorough analysis of something like 700 books that are used for shared reading and different reading curricula. It was sort of a mind-blowing experience, and probably not surprising to many of you. 76% of all of the books that are for shared or interactive reading in the curricula, in the very common curricula, were all fiction. And within that 76% of the books, 38% of those fiction books were realistic fiction, and 26% of the fiction books were fantasy. So what students are getting exposed to most often in terms of the subgenre within the genre of fiction is realistic fiction and fantasy. So they're getting a lot of familiarity with that, a lot of understanding of how those sorts of books work, and less familiarity with other types of fiction that include poetry, for example, or drama, so less exposure to those. Among the nonfiction books within the set, 99% of nonfiction was expository. And I'm going to talk about the language of expository and what we mean about all that in a little bit. So most often we're seeing that as opposed to biography or a persuasive piece or some sort of instructional piece, which makes sense when we're referring to shared reading and interactive reading. Of science and social studies texts, we see among those, we see longer words that have lower frequency levels. This is not at all surprising to all of you, but I'm going to connect it here in just a moment. There's a heavier use of proper names and longer sentences. That makes these books more complex at that level. And then you add in background knowledge into these nonfiction texts, especially science and social studies texts. And that tends to make nonfiction texts harder for students for a variety of reasons. They are less commonly exposed to nonfiction texts. The nonfiction texts contain features semantically and syntactically that are harder, and they are more reliant upon conceptual knowledge or background information in order to maintain comprehension. So not surprisingly, we see higher inference performance among students reading fictional narratives as opposed to any other kind of text. But this was true across text complexity. It was true across when the questions were asked, before reading, during reading, after reading. So this crossed a lot of issues that we otherwise might say, but what about if you do this with the books, or what about if you do that? So in this particular study, They matched text by genre and by difficulty, and they still found that inferential comprehension was stronger among narrative fiction texts. I think most of us have seen that even anecdotally or in working with children, so it's perhaps not very surprising, but it's good for grounding us as we move forward. The next thing I want to talk about then as we, sorry, my pointer and my advance are getting confused here. When we look at the subgenre within fiction and nonfiction, there's really quite a variety. And this is why I say when we're kind of focused on one type, it means that students aren't getting exposed to other types within our gross genre here. And most of what students experience in the text that they have in school are essays and expository text, and that's where we're going to focus. Those of you familiar with Common Core know that we talk about informational text and informational comprehension. Informational, when we really pull out the subgenre of nonfiction text, is often more closely associated with instructional text. But I think what we mean in Common Core is really expository text. It just changed up the language on us and required us to refer to it in different ways. So tonight, I am going to use expository and informational interchangeably because that's the area in which we're going to be talking about things like text structure. But you may see it defined differently in other types of research or in other sources based on the way that the subgenre are identified for nonfiction. So when we're talking about what I'm referring to interchangeably here as informational and expository text, oftentimes the genre study part becomes about these text structures or the organizational patterns for information within these kinds of texts. And these are the common ones. Some people refer to 9 different text structures. Some people refer to fewer. So there's no hard and fast exactly what the number of text structures would be. But these are probably 5 of the most common and ones that you've probably seen before. This is at the macro structure level. We're going to talk about the difference between macro and micro structure a little bit later, but we're referring to this big overarching organizational pattern that helps us understand how one piece of information relates to another piece of information within a text. The research on text structure instruction is both really exciting and also a little bit, makes you stop and think, but how practical is that really? So what we have found is that when we really focus on teaching text structure, we can get improvements in students' comprehension of text. And they can identify text structures. But here's the trick. Most of the time in research, we are using contrived texts that are carefully constructed to reinforce that particular text structure that we're trying to get students to learn. And they intentionally include signal words or cueing features that we're trying to help students grow some sort of sensitivity to. That is a very logical approach for getting students to feel comfortable with that and having some experience with identifying these patterns. However, when you stop using contrived text, which is what you do pretty much every day when you're teaching in reading and in literature classes, we fail to see transfer among students, and the long-term effects in the Bogarts and Hazenberg piece is a meta-analysis looking across a lot of studies of text structure. There's a lack of long-term effects. There are things you can do to support some long-term effects where students maintain their knowledge of text structure, but the hardest thing is that movement from really contrived text to the sorts of text that you would find every day, especially in science and social studies class. They're not contrived, so it makes it really challenging. And the things that we teach them, like signal words, aren't universals. Signal words might signal multiple text structures. They may be present or they may not be present. If we teach those as a crutch for students, you can see why, in the end, the effect of teaching that wears off when we go to other kinds of texts that don't provide those similar supports in that consistent of a fashion. To show you what that looks like, let's all do this together. So here's a paragraph. I'm going to give you a moment to read it, and then I'm going to ask you to identify the text structure. Okay, we've got some answers coming in. No one's disagreeing. Look at all of you go. Compare, contrast, compare, contrast, compare, contrast. It sets it up so beautifully, doesn't it? Chimpanzees and humans are alike in many ways. So it sets it up right from the beginning. It gives us the two things that we're comparing. They use some nice words for us. They're alike in many ways. And then they're going to tell us the ways that they're alike. And a little bit later, it says, of course, there are many ways that they're different. So it gives us another cue, and then it's going to tell us the ways that they're different. So it sets it up beautifully. This is a very contrived, carefully constructed paragraph to reinforce the compare contrast text structure. Okay, so yes, and Suzanne, I agree with you. It's such a lovely topic sentence. So that is lovely. But here's what happens. This paragraph becomes then this passage. Okay, so you see our top paragraph is the same. Now, take a look at the other paragraphs in our passage and tell me what we have. So we have people answering, here we're starting to separate out. We had a problem solution in there. Even somebody with a question mark, I don't know, maybe problem solution. Yeah, and somebody, Mary, says at the last paragraph, Mary, you'd be right. So every paragraph in this passage changes the text structure. The first paragraph that we read previously is compare contrast. The second paragraph is cause effect. The third paragraph is sequence. The fourth paragraph is description. And the fifth paragraph is problem solution. This is what happens in a regular text that kids read. Paragraph to paragraph, section to section, the text structure changes. And how helpful is it if we tell students, you have to stop and rethink the text structure in every single paragraph? How do I then figure out overall how I'm supposed to connect all of these paragraphs? The benefit of text structure is supposed to be that I can figure out how to relate information, how I'm supposed to connect these pieces together. But as the pieces get longer and further apart, and we have more paragraphs or sections, then we lose that connection. And we lose the value of looking at it in that really finite, controlled, and careful way. And we have to start thinking about overall, what is the text structure? Even if it changes from paragraph to paragraph, what is it? What are we trying to accomplish overall? What is the author's purpose in communicating this message overall? Or what is the standard you're trying to accomplish with sharing this information? So we have to transition kids from looking for really carefully designed things to getting sort of a gestalt impression of the overall piece. That's a challenge. And that requires greater inferencing skills, which is why we see a lot more struggle in there. Somebody said they like the word macro structure for teachers. Yep. And so
there is a
go ahead.
question. Is this why it's less effective to teach just one type for a few weeks rather than deeper comprehension?
Say that again. Is it less effective to, oh, there it is, to teach
Yes.
one type?
Is this why it's less effective to teach just one type for a few weeks rather than deeper comprehension?
When we're teaching individual text structures, we teach one type at a time, but then we put them together cumulatively. You have to get to more than one text structure. I think there's no other way to start than to start with these individual, carefully constructed paragraphs. Otherwise, it's kind of self-defeating from the onset, and kids wonder, why the heck are we doing this? It seems to be a guessing game. I've put teachers together in a room and given them a typical article that you would find in a news blog or something, and they will argue about the text structure. Adults don't agree on what it is. And so it just starts to feel like, why are we even bothering with this? So there's no other way to start than to start with the carefully constructed paragraphs so that kids get a sense of what that's like. But I guess my point is that we have to at some point start to pull back a little bit and not be so dependent on that careful construction, and just starting to figure out, how do we get that overall big idea? Or how do we relate this back to the author's purpose in general in communicating this information, even if from paragraph to paragraph it's going to switch a little bit. I'm going to relate this. I'm going to return to this idea when we get to fictional narratives, and I'm going to talk about how changing text structures isn't necessarily the problem. Because we do it in fictional narratives all the time and nobody says anything about it. So there's more going on in informational text that makes it problematic. And it requires more supports from other aspects of Scarborough's rope related to vocabulary and syntax and background knowledge and inferencing and all of those things. So I'm going to try to keep connecting back to that, to say it's not that text structure isn't important. It's just that we're reaching the boundaries of the existing research. And it's time for us to move on. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there were a couple of questions, one from Margaret and one from Renee, but I think you answered them. But if I'm wrong about that, Margaret or Renee, please feel free to unmute. I think
what was the analogy that Nancy gave? I missed it somewhere.
Nancy Hubbard said, carefully contrived text is the decodable text of text structure.
Yeah, that is the perfect way to describe that.
Oh, and then there is one question, sorry, and someone said, love that, Nancy. How would you define the last passage in terms of teaching text structure to students?
Oh, what would we say was the text structure for that? Well, a lot of you said description, which, I mean, you could take the whole thing as a description of chimps. I mean, we start out by comparing and contrasting chimps with humans, which connects to probably existing knowledge for children. And then we move into some different things so that we can know about chimps. So I would probably agree that overall it could be a description text, but what's really important is, what's the point of this lesson? So it's not even just so much that I'll read this text and say, it's probably overall description, but what are we trying to get out of having kids read this text? And that's how we need to orient them for this, so that they're putting that information together in the way that they're going to be held accountable for it. So finding some way to connect back to your standard or to your established learning objectives for the day is probably more important than arguing over what should the overall structure be. So just to contrast our macro structure with the micro structure so that you know that there are these two facets, we're not talking about microstructure today. And the reason is because microstructure comes in a different element of Scarborough's rope, which you had a portion of before with syntax. I heard Pam introduced that. So it includes syntactic structures, different linguistic devices that are really very popular in research right now, looking at pronoun reference, for example, and helping kids track the pronoun reference is a really common area of research right now. But also the density of ideas, how packed in the information is within a text is part of looking at the microstructure of it. But we're not talking about that tonight, just an acknowledgement that we're at the macro structure level and there are other elements of Scarborough's rope. So when we're teaching these text structures, there are three common approaches to teaching that macro structure, where we're looking at things like description, cause effect, compare, contrast, problem solution. The first is how do we recognize it? And there are often annotating techniques that we get kids to underline and circle different things that cue it, or in some way reference the way that that information is organized and related. The second is with visualization strategies that commonly include graphic organizers. And the graphic organizer is supposed to provide this picture of that relationship among the ideas in the text. So it puts it in a graphic way that allows you to see the relationship graphically. And then you plug in the information in there. There are also maps and schema, which some people just lump all together within graphic organizers. So there are just different ways to provide that visual imagery around the relationship of ideas. And the final way that people use text structure, and even some of these tools that we're talking about with graphic organizers for text structure, is to have students summarize the text. Ultimately, then they use that structure in a smaller fashion where they're emulating it to produce a summary of the text. And that can be really supportive. Oftentimes, we scaffold that with frames or outlines, or it may start by having students identify main ideas for each paragraph and then summarize the main ideas together, so that you're kind of incorporating all of those different text structures in there. But that often is a culminating step of having attended to text structure. For more information that we have on how to use text structures, especially as kids get older, and how to relate text structures, we have a practitioner article out in Teaching Exceptional Children, a different doctoral student of mine, that has this, what you see in the background of the slide there. It has a really helpful guide for you, including what we call structure partners, to account for that fact that often we don't have a single text structure within a text. We have multiple text structures, and how do we relate them and help build on the information and connect the information in that way. I also want to say that one of the big differences between nonfiction text and fiction text is the amount of background knowledge that's necessary to comprehend. So sure, text structure is important, but really you have to have some understanding, some background knowledge to build upon in order for you to have solid comprehension of the text and a easy pathway to understanding the relationship among the ideas in the text. And that, of course, is a different element of Scarborough's rope, which my doctoral advisor and mentor, Sharon Bond, apparently presented for you. So it's great that we can keep this all in our academic family here. So we won't talk about that tonight, but it's a big element that is probably more influential even than text structure for nonfiction text. So we talked about nonfiction. I want to go back to this slide where we have the subgenre and say, now we're going to take a look at fiction and how this plays out for fiction texts. And acknowledging that most of the fiction texts that we're using with kids for shared reading and interactive reading are realistic fiction and fantasy text. So what does this mean when we kind of take those same ideas that we've talked about with nonfiction, with the macro structure, and overlay that onto fiction text? You get a story map, for example. So we have different narrative elements here that are in relationship to each other that help us understand what's going on in this story and how the different parts of the story hang together and produce a whole. But this is complicated in the sense that there are a lot of narrative elements in here. It isn't just a map. You have to understand what characters are. You have to understand what a setting is. You have to understand what events are. So it's not quite as simple as just saying we've got to find these pieces and plug them in on this organizer. We have to understand what they are in the first place. So the development of narrative processing skills starts really young, especially when you're doing shared reading, even in the home. And so it's ages 4 to 6, as you see on this slide, and includes things such as creating narratives from pictures before we're even expecting children to do it from stories that we read to them or that they tell us even. They can create narratives from pictures. Then they develop an understanding of character and they start to understand some of the causal structures that lead one event to another within a story. And then we start to ask them comprehension questions. So all of that is occurring and developing at very early ages, 4 to 6. And you'll notice that we have this as one of the skills that's developing in ages 4 to 6, causal structures. And we had just a moment ago in our informational text, we had cause-effect relationships that we said were a macro structure of informational or expository text. So they're not distinct. There's still a piece of these other macro structures apparent in fiction, even though we think of the macro structure of our most common fictional narratives as being the story map. So how do those play out? When we take those macro structures from nonfiction, where do we see them in our fictional narratives? Well, there's description when we're talking about characters and settings. We describe characters and settings. There's the sequence of events that occurs within our story. We can compare different characters and settings, compare or contrast them. We have cause and effect around the events that drive the plot along. And we have problem and solution because there's a main conflict that has to get resolved by the end of the story. So this is why I say the idea that nonfiction is so hard because it contains all of these text structures that kids are totally unfamiliar with, and then we throw them all together in a text. That's not quite acknowledging what all is happening in a fictional narrative. All of those same structures are mixed together and part of what we have in a fictional narrative as well. But the difference is often background knowledge. Right? It's not to communicate new information that we expect kids to learn. It's to understand the story that comes together as a whole. So I'm always a little bit cautious or nervous when researchers start saying, well, it's because kids are so unfamiliar with these text structures. I don't think that that's true. I think they're used in different ways in fictional text as opposed to nonfiction text. But there are other things that make nonfiction text hard and make it hard to even apply what we know about these macro structures to the text. Okay, so we're gonna change gears. So I'll pause for just a minute, Pam, because this is probably really gonna blow people's hair back. So any questions or things we need to attend to?
I hope you're reading the chat because everyone's really enjoying it, saying, cool, this is enlightening. And so,
Oh, good.
Not questions, just accolades. So there you go, Dr. Reed.
Okay, so prepare for hair to blow. This is the other part of understanding the genre of fictional narratives is what we call theory of mind. This is almost never discussed in teacher preparation programs, I would say. But theory of mind has to do with your understanding of mental states and motivations and feelings that you have that are probably different from what somebody else has. It's the basis of understanding that we would have different perspectives on a situation, that we would have different viewpoints. And if you can understand that with human beings, you can begin to apply that to characters in a fictional narrative, because that's a really important part about understanding conflict within the narrative and the actions that characters take that advance that plot through the conflict and eventually have a resolution in there. And theory of mind starts developing very young, as everything else that we have talked about tonight starts really young. So at 3 and above, you learn theory of mind as a speech therapist. Thank you, Kelly. So all of our teacher prep candidates should be taking a speech class. I say that quite not facetiously at all, quite honestly, because I think there's a lot going on in the speech classes that we wish teachers would know. Theory of mind is now another one. So how do we relate theory of mind then to narrative comprehension when we take that concept of understanding mental states and differences in perspectives and emotions between human beings and apply that to characters in a narrative? So it also applies to a single character and understanding the spatial relations that characters have about their place in a setting and what they perceive and how they interact in that setting. It helps us understand the difference between where a character is and what a character is thinking about, because in a fictional narrative, you get lots of thoughts that you're reading about as well. So you have to understand that distinction. And again, the motives of why characters take certain actions that are involved in those events that drive the plot forward and seek resolution. To our two sides of the conflict, we have two different perspectives. So one character's perspective on a situation and mental states would be different from the character that they're in conflict with. And their idea of how to reach resolution or what a good solution would be quite different from each other. So let's take an example. If you're still kind of a little fuzzy on what this means, let's take a really simple example from the Little Red Riding Hood study by Riggio and Cassidy. So this was conducted with children ages 3 to 5. And I have the picture on here of this part of Little Red Riding Hood that they presented or where they stopped and asked the students questions. If the children had underdeveloped theory of mind, the response about this scene, this part of the story, was that there's a wolf in her bed, right? Little Red Riding Hood goes to her grandmother's house. She's in her grandmother's house to bring in this food, and there was a wolf in the bed. If you have better developed theory of mind, those children would answer that Little Red Riding Hood thought her grandmother was there, but really it was a wolf. So understanding what the character was thinking in relation to what was actually occurring, this idea that the wolf could trick her, that Little Red Riding Hood went in with one expectation and one perspective on this scene, but there was something else entirely happening with this other character that sort of tricked her. That made it something that she was not expecting. And it's not what she believed when she first walked in. So that theory of mind element is understanding that Little Red Riding Hood believes something. She thinks something that is different from the reality of the situation, and that there was something done intentionally to make her believe that. So there was some trickery involved in what occurred that led to her believing that, because that's what the wolf wanted, was for her to think that. So that's all part of acquiring this understanding of theory of mind. And again, this was in ages 3 through 5. So it starts to occur very early. We can influence it, as with everything else we've talked tonight about, with doing shared reading. So lots of shared reading for a different purpose. However, this also involves inferencing. So this is just another quick acknowledgement to a different element of Scarborough's rope that has to do with inferencing. If you're understanding that the character believes this and there was trickery and this is why, and you're doing a lot of inferencing, you're applying a lot of inferencing skills. So in order to advance theory of mind, we also have to help children acquire inferencing ability, but we're just going to stick with theory of mind in general. So before, we looked at doing a read aloud with print focus, and all the things that we said and pointed out had to do with features of print. Now we're going to talk about the same book pages, but this time we're going to do a read aloud for an entirely different purpose and look at the kinds of questions that we might ask that would emphasize characters, setting in both time and place, events, and the character motives. So here are our pages that we had before, but this time we might ask, why do you think Rigoberto is introducing himself here? He says, my name is Rigoberto. We just moved here from Venezuela. Why do you think he's introducing himself? And then you might ask, where is Rigoberto when he is introducing himself? It says, and because they don't understand, the classroom will fill with laughter until the teacher quiets everyone. So do we understand this setting of where is he? And then character motives. What happened when Rigoberto introduced him? I'm sorry, this is cause effect. What happened when Rigoberto introduced himself? He just said his name, where he was from, and what happened after that. So we're emphasizing the cause effect relationship within that event. Taking our other pages that we looked at before, again, changing this around from print focused to narrative focused for narrative development. We might ask, if the teacher is asking what everyone did last summer, what time of year is it now? So this is setting not by place, but by time. So how do we develop that skill of understanding setting by time? Which character did not travel anywhere over the summer? How do you think the character feels when the other students are talking about their summer trips? We've read this part about everyone saying where they went and showing their souvenirs. And she says her own untraveled hands. So there's a way to talk about character feelings and contrasting one character's emotional state with the emotional states of the other characters in here. So Pam, you said nobody finished on time. I'm going to be the first to finish on time tonight.
There is a question real quick, if you don't mind me jumping in.
Yes, absolutely.
It's from Robin. Would you ever combine print focus and narrative focus read aloud to maximize time, or does that make it too muddled?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Robin, because we don't want to stop too frequently within the text and break up students' comprehension too much. I do think that you could combine print focused and narrative or meaning focused questions within your read aloud, but you'd have to be really judicious about where you were going to ask what kinds of questions to make sure that you're not stopping the reading too frequently. I'm also really glad you asked that question, because I showed you 3 different questions that you could ask off of each of the pages that we looked at. That's way too many questions. And we did the same thing with the print focused read aloud. I just tried to limit the number of pages I was showing so I wasn't violating copyright. But I was giving you examples of the different kinds of questions. And I don't think that I did a good enough job pointing out that I wouldn't necessarily ask all of these, especially not on a single page, because now kids have totally lost what we're reading about in this story.
There's another, if it's okay.
Yep.
This one's from Shauna. How do you suggest to get students to understand what a question is asking? I teach high school learning support, and my students do not answer basic why, where, when, who questions.
Yeah, so there are strategies for understanding questioning types. And one of the common approaches we use and others have used too is the first you understand the different kinds of questions, what are fact-based questions versus questions that require some degree of inference. And we move from really short inferences that are very close together that just require some simple putting together of information or gap filling to inferences that require bigger extensions across the text or connecting with other texts, et cetera. So there's sort of a gradual progression, but first you have to understand what those question types are and how to kind of process what the question is asking you, which I think is your point that they struggle with that. So there are steps and strategies for doing that. And then once you teach that to children, then we turn the tables on them and we show them how they can write their own questions so that they're not so dependent upon us to provide them the questions all the time. But we want them to be self-generating the questions. That will carry you through into older children as well, which I think is what I heard Pam say, is that you had older students. So.
Mm-hmm. Are there further questions? I'll keep an eye on the chat as you summarize, Dr. Reed.
Okay, great. Again, we had one of the most interesting little strands here of Scarborough's reading rope, and one of the ones that seemingly on the surface is quite simple or straightforward, but that has a lot of nuances to it and a lot of areas where we just need some additional research that we don't have enough yet to really know how to help students through all of these difficulties. We have good research on concepts of print. We know what we should be doing with concepts of print. So there's not a whole lot of excuse for not doing the right things there. But as we get into understanding genre, there are many more sort of complexities to it that we don't have all ironed out yet. The main takeaway I would say on concepts of print is that simply putting it around in the environment is insufficient. It requires direct instruction. We really have to call it out, get students to attend to it, talk about what they're supposed to be attending to in there, use the language that we want them to acquire about letters and words and punctuation and what this means. And then we spent the majority of our time talking about genre. We know that fictional texts are easier to comprehend, but that's for lots of reasons. It's greater exposure, it's the limited reliance upon background knowledge, and hopefully it's because some of those narrative skills and theory of mind skills are acquired so early and can advantage students as they transition from understanding what people do to understanding what characters do. I will add a final note about that, however, that there is a line of research among children on the autism spectrum that would suggest that at least some autism is a spectrum. So this is not about all kids, but at least some of the kids on the spectrum have a really difficult time with theory of mind. That idea that I have ideas and feelings that aren't the same as somebody else's ideas and feelings is a particular challenge for those children. And so understanding characters and what's going on with characters is something that is nonsensical to them. Whereas for others, it seems like a very natural thing. So it's something to pay attention to. Story grammar and text structure are not as simplistic as we make them out to be, and they are also not as distinct between fiction and nonfiction texts as we commonly talk about them being. There's a great deal of overlap and a lot of misunderstanding about, and a lot of limits to the research, I should say, about how we teach this for the long term to really help children be successful, especially with a nonfiction text. We looked at a lot of different ways to use shared reading and book reading with kids to learn the different kinds of skills. So understanding what the intent of your lesson is and how to focus kids' reading during those experiences can build either single skills or multiple skills, as we talked about towards the end in answering the question. So those are my big takeaways from our talk tonight, but I welcome any additional questions or comments that you have.
I don't see any questions at this time. I'm seeing a lot of thanks in the chat to you. And I hope that you saw them along the way. Words like enlightening, eye-opening, very, very positive comments about what you taught us this evening, Dr. Reed, but also truly appreciated the application of that learning. So you really, as you said, blew our, our heads off a little bit, but also really gave us lots of practical application for the research and reminded us how integrated the rope is. And so thank you for that. And I hope that you take a moment to look at the chat as people write thank yous in the chat. I'm also going to place in the chat the form for those who are attending who wish to have Act 48 hours for this series. Please make sure that you complete this form no later than midnight. I always say, you know, just do it now so it's done. I also placed in the chat that our last, I can't believe it, it's been since February. Our final session will be November 30th. Nancy Hennessy and I are going to be working diligently to summarize and celebrate this series. So please return to us just one last time on November 30th. And please share the Padlet, the Literacy Resource Hub from Patton, the YouTube channel where these presentations are recorded and resources are there. There's lots in addition to this reading series, but we really encourage you to share with your colleagues. That's what we're all about is spreading the word around the science of reading. So once again, thank you for joining us this evening. Big thank you to Nancy Hennessy, Kirsten DeRoche, and Andrew Bell on our team for joining as well. And also a great debt of gratitude to you, Dr. Reed, for joining us for this series. You taught us so much. and we are greatly appreciative. And we'll
Oh,
see you
it's
on the 30th.
a lot of fun for me. Thank you for having me.
It was an honor. Thank you.
That was a wonderful look at this particular strand of the rope, a deeper dive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy.
And I've just placed the form once again into the chat so that you can complete that if you're seeking Act 48 credit. And I always stay on until everyone feels comfortable. So please feel free to stay on, and we're here to help. Thank you, Dr. Reed.